All right, well, it's 6 o'clock, so good evening, everyone. I think we're short on a few people, but I'm sure they'll be along very, very soon. So welcome back to week number 3 of Intergovernmental Relations. I hope everyone's doing well. Thank you for your beach board posts from our past week. I've gone through and graded all of those and provided some feedback. I think everyone did a really nice job of talking about the relationships of different levels of government on your intergovernmental issue of choice. Then for next week, your next beach board assignment will be looking at governments as interest groups and looking at public interest groups. And that will be our topic for tonight, looking at the political aspects of intergovernmental relations. And for that beach board posting, you'll be selecting one public interest group and then talking about how that public interest group has lobbied Congress and some of the relative success that, if they've had any success, some of the relative success that public interest group has had. So that's for your next beach board posting. Over the past couple of weeks, we have looked at the constitutional basis of intergovernmental relations. This week, we're focusing on the political basis of intergovernmental relations. Next week, we'll turn our attention to the fiscal basis for intergovernmental relations. The week after that, we'll do the administrative aspects. And then our final week, we will look at the future challenges to intergovernmental relations. So this week is all about politics and the political aspects. According to my chart, it looks like we have 5 articles that we'll be covering for tonight. We have Federalist number 39, which is crystals. We have the Governments as Interest Groups article, which is Sam's. We have the Trends of Cooperation article, which is Monica's. The Ways of Achieving Federal Objectives, which belongs to Kieran, and then the Beyond Preemption, which is Janine's. Kieran did reach out to me and ask if they could start tonight, and so I'll let Kieran start tonight and do the Ways of Achieving Federal Objectives. And then once Kieran is done, then we'll have Crystal, we'll have you on deck then to do Federalist number 39, and then we'll move on from there. So if there are no questions or anything at all, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Kieran. I've enabled screen sharing again, so you should be able to share your screen if you have any slides, and the floor will be yours.
I did have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Hi, sorry, Kieran. For this week's postings regarding public interest groups, can this also include special interest groups, or just has to stick to public interest groups?
It's really looking more at public interest groups. So, National Builders Association, National League of Cities, U.S. Conference of Mayors, National Conference of State Legislatures. Those are the types of interest groups we're looking at for this week.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Okay, Karen, go ahead.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Is my voice okay? Okay, yep. Perfect. So hi, everyone. My name is Kieran Kaur, and I will be leading the discussion on Ways of Achieving Federal Objectives by Martha Durthik. And this discussion is really about federal government's role in the state. So the article is divided into different subsections, and the first subsection is regarding federal government in state politics. Durthik discusses that the federal government is an actor in the state political system, and they do so by giving grants and attaching conditions to those grants. It's also mentioned that the federal government is rather a peripheral actor than an integral actor in the state, and we'll find out why. But the idea is that the way this federal government becomes an actor in the state is by altering the environment within which all of these integral actors function, by altering the distribution of influence among them. And so think about grants, think about money talking, think about the money's influence and how the integral actors will function. So all of this, complicated mesh is how the federal government becomes an actor in state politics. The selection of subjects for what's going to become public policy, what are the issues that need to be discussed for public agenda, is really how is really actually the first step in determining the federal influence and how it's felt in the state system. Otherwise, typically you tend to think that states just kind of independently acting on its own, but when you talk about public agenda, it really has a federal influence in it. And so by offering grants for specified activities and setting some certain stipulations or conditions with that, the government is really putting something on a political agenda and saying if this activity should be undertaken or not, and parallelly setting these conditions, I'll give you money for this, I'll give you money for that, is how the federal government kind of ties itself into the state politics. So, it's to note that the federal government does not really place itself on the agenda of state politics. It's really doing this everything indirectly. What it really does is it stimulates these proposals by the actors that are integral to state political systems. You're talking about elected executives, legislative officials, these administrators that are appointed, party officials, executives of pressure groups. They could be in this section as well. So for these state political actors, or all of them have political aspirations, or political actors / aspirants who really share independently, I want to say not just all, but some of the federal goals. These federal actions, they create opportunities or quote unquote excuses for making of proposals. Having, because it's all through grants, it's all through money, having the federal support via federal sponsorship, it reduces the cost of making a proposal because you're not funding it by the state, but there's federal funding that's coming in, and you're able to easily take a subsequent action. So it's helpful. So all of the action takers are that are going to take care of this action, they think it's desirable to do a certain task or certain activity because it will secure federal funding. Overall, the subsection of this federal influence in the state politics, it kind of discusses that the federal government exercises its influence in large part by stimulating demands from groups within the state and by placing quote unquote extra resources of influence at their disposal. So that's how the federal government is influencing the state politics. And to make it a discussion, I do have a question, and the question is, how does the federal government work in the state? A, through allies, B, through federal agencies, C, through force, and D, all of the above. So if you could write down an answer in the chat. I think it's all of it, and it's actually A, it's through allies. I'm surprised everybody said D, which means I probably didn't do a good job in describing how the federal government is working in the state. So the federal agencies, the way they work in state is that they typically have state counterparts, so that's probably tricky. There are federal agencies that have direct influence in the state. So one example that I shared last week during Karina's presentation was, I think federal EPA, and then it divides things into regions. So Cal EPA, so that becomes a state agency that has a role to, accomplish the federal objectives, and really not through force, because force is not going to accomplish anything. There's a lot of political manipulation that goes on, and it can't be all of the above. So it's actually through allies. So I didn't intend to make this a trick question, but maybe the question wasn't phrased right. So the federal government really works in the state through allies. Okay, so let me go to the next slide. There is another question, which is, how is the federal government a peripheral actor and not an integral actor in the state's political system? A, no formal right to make decisions. B, no recognized informal right to function as a lobby. C, all of the above. And D, none of the above. I'll see if you could write that one in the chat box. I'm not sure if I'm going to get more answers, but it's actually C, all of the above. So the federal government actually has no formal right to make decisions in the state, and it also there's no recognized informal right to function as a lobby. So it's both factors that make the federal government kind of an actor on the periphery rather than an integral actor in the state's political system. That is why we're discussing this topic of how they involve themselves in the state's political system. The second major subsection that the article kind of talks about is the state agency acting as a federal ally. So one of the questions that I'd asked last time is how, the federal government is actually performing or functioning in the state. It really is through allies. So now we know that federal government can't really directly control the functioning of the state. What it really needs is it needs a permanent ally, an ally that's always organized, always prepared to take action, always receptive to federal communications, and also has interests that align with the federal administration. So the way the federal government accomplishes it is by actually creating a state agency as an ally. And it's, if you actually choose an existing agency and make them your ally versus which has all existing rules and procedures and values and systems in place versus creating or calling a new agency into existence, it's easier to make a state agency your ally if you call a new agency into existence. So the federal government does create these state agencies as allies by calling an agency into existence. And then it ends up shaping its values and conceptions of purpose, which are consistent with federal objectives. So you make a new agency, you call this agency into existence, you shape its values, which align with your goals. And then the next final step is to make it powerful. So you enhance the agency's power and autonomy at the state level. This is how you're controlling that state agency as an ally, and you actually have indirect influence through the state agency onto the state. So, really smart, actually. It's known to me all along the way with my job as well, and how state, the sanitation district gets funded, how state gets funded. But it was really an interesting read. This article, the way it puts together, it was really incredible. So, all along the way, federal government, it knows that for all or any of the federal preferences to prevail, the professionalization of personnel is really what's needed, because they are the people that are going to have this common body of values and doctrines. So you can call a new agency into existence as well. You can shape its value, but it really comes down to people and their professionalization and how how their goals, like what type of goals they encompass. And if that happens, if you have, through this professionalization of personnel, it really results in the elimination of this federal state conflict, because one of the things that the federal government is really trying to do is to eliminate any kind of conflict with the state. It would do so by sugarcoating, manipulation, indirect ways, but not really a direct federal state conflict. So indoctrination of the state agency helps sharing of values between the state and federal government. And one of the things that article mentioned was that, this indoctrination of the state agency is really a federal administrator's only, defense against this persistent and this pervasive, problem that arises, that the state governments tend to agree to federally stipulated actions because they think that doing so will bring them a large influx of money, not because they align with their goals, but by this indoctrination of the state agency, you want to make sure that people are doing things because they also share those values, not necessarily just for the money. So federal action, it contributes to state agency power and autonomy in various ways. And one of the most obvious ways is this condition of a single state agency requirement. So on the basis of this provision, federal administrators, they've insisted that agency possess enough authority to ensure that federal conditions are met. So the agency is very powerful. And that's the second part. Enhancing the counterpart's power is the primary end of federal action, because that's how you are, you're putting yourself on the state level. Now, as this grant recipient, as this agency that's getting federal grant, you become very powerful, because you're endowed with these resources independent of the action of the governor or legislature. You're not asking them for money, you're getting this federal grant, which makes you very powerful. And through acting as a federal grant recipient and having these resources, these state agencies, they also act as passive channels to local agencies. So now from the federal level, you've come to the state level and you act as these passive channels to local agencies because you're funding them. So when you're doing this, you're rulemaking because you're telling the agencies how. You're giving the agencies these money, so you have a leverage as a rulemaker. You're supervising the administration of these rules, and indirectly, the stipulation of federal conditions, they're increasing the state power because there's a stimulation that happens. So the summary of this topic, when you're talking about first how the federal administration controls itself in the state, choosing the state agency, the final discussion point really is this alliance between federal and state administrative agencies. It becomes a very, very powerful force in state politics. And when I was actually reading this, I thought about this one agency that I deal with all the time. It's SAPA, it's Santa Ana Watershed Authority, Project Authority, which gets these independently funded, by EPA, and tends to control a lot of the SoCal region's sanitation district activities, and controls a lot of the rights for how much water it can put into this agency versus that agency, because it sits on this panel that helps issuing these ocean discharge permits to sanitation districts. So that was one agency that was coming to my mind when I was reading about this. From a discussion standpoint, the question for this topic is, how does the federal influence operate at the state level? A, through the agency that receives grants and with the agency's self-serving cooperation. B, by enhancing the role that the agency plays in the state's political system and by shaping the agency's values, goals, interests, and actions. C, all of the above. Okay, so I'm going to take that as all of the people. So yes, it's C, it's all of the above. So the federal influence at the state level, it's through the state agency that's receiving its grants, and also cooperating at the same time. And, and they align with the values, goals, and interests and actions. It's both of them. The next major topic that was discussed in the article after the state agency's discussion is withholding of funds. Now, federal administration has decided that they want to control the state indirectly through these state agencies. But what if the state agencies are not in alignment with federal goals or are not acting in their best interests? What do you do in that case? You have to enforce. And one of the very popular enforcement strategies that the federal government holds in its hand is withholding of funds. So it's the ultimate resource of federal influence, but the article discusses that it's actually impossible to use it because withholding really serves no one's interest. It does not serve the interests of the feds. It doesn't serve the interests of the state agency. So given the limits of its influence, federal administration is actually heavily dependent upon maintaining their goodwill and disposition to cooperate, and therefore is always just seeking to avoid direct hostile confrontations with state governments, such as withholding of funds, which is interesting to me. It doesn't mean that it's a tool that's out the window. It's still a tool in their pocket. But it just means that from a federal perspective, they know that it's not something that they can easily do. So it's best to maintain goodwill and, not have this direct hostile confrontation. One other method that's discussed from an enforcement perspective in the article is actually audit exceptions, which in principle, it's a penalty for specific non-conforming acts of expenditure. So it's not like you're holding the entire budget, but it's certain acts of expenditure that you can hold on to. So that's another tool in their pocket. The article discusses that it's more feasible to use than withholding of the funds, but it's incredibly inconvenient to administer and also applies not to the entire expenditure, but only a particular act. So now the federal administration kind of runs into this thing that they want to enforce, but the two enforcement strategies they have in their pocket: withholding of funds, which is difficult, and audit exception, which is difficult to implement as well. So really the difficulty with withholding and audit exception is why the aim of federal enforcement activity is to make sure that they're bringing compliance in advance and they avoid any direct confrontations. Again, I want to mention in this topic, even though it said, I kind of gave you guys in a gist that it's really difficult to implement withholding of the funds or audit exceptions, but it is one of the major resources of federal influence, and can be used as a potential resource. I did want to talk about something that was discussed in a couple paragraphs in the article, that this whole conversation, this whole enforcement strategy, it's a diplomatic process. No statements are made in public, so it's private conversations that are happening. The federal administration refrains from making overt threats, and they're very patient. So the item stood out to me because of our last class in negotiation that we'd taken, so it was interesting to read that. So the next question, which I haven't mentioned in the slides before, but just wanted to ask the class: where do you think is the status of the federal and state relationship? Do you think federal administration acts as a defensive and state acts as the aggressive, or if it's B, federal acts as the aggressive and the state acts as defensive? Okay, that might actually be everybody. So it is right. It's B. Federal is the aggressive and state is the defensive. And that's because, the federal administration has a greater interest in making sure the change is facilitated. So even though we were talking about the tactics of, them avoiding hostile confrontation and really making sure things are happening smoothly, but at the end of the day, they still are the aggressive and state is the defensive because the feds have a greater interest in making sure the change is facilitated. This is in conclusion. I really recommend everybody to actually read this article. It was really good to read for me from an agency that I work at. What to remember and really to take away is that the federal government works in the state through allies, and through the allies, they're working through monetary channels, grants, creating single state agencies, and these grant systems. And I actually had, it was just really funny to me that I all of these 4 items that are listed on there, the grant systems actually offer people this diffusion of responsibility, because when you can call these agencies to account for controversial actions that you're not okay with, they can actually blame each other. So they can escape responsibility by saying the federal administration asked them to do that, and the feds can say the local agencies implemented something. And that's really, if you're a regulator, that's a tool that you use in the field quite a lot. For a lot of what we implement, me as an engineer for Orange County Sanitation District, when we go out to industries and we ask them to implement certain pre-treatment standards for wastewater, and they tell us things are very expensive and we can't survive in California, this is really a tool that we use. We tell them we can't do anything because it's the EPA that dictates it to Cal EPA. So I can see how this is actually being played out. Then the other part is each legislature can escape responsibility as well via its own constituents. And so, this grant system, it actually gives the ability of all major official actors to deny responsibility, reducing the chance of a successful opposition. So I thought it's really important in conclusion for the article, but it's funny as well how the intergovernmental relationships in the blame game actually continues. So that's it for my topic. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Karen. Well done. And I agree, it is an important article. And I think pick up on a couple of major points that you made. The one point about conflict, and as you said, the federal government really does have this vested interest in trying to avoid conflict, because we know in order to implement a policy or a program, you need to have the acceptance on the part of your implementers. Pressman Waldowski told us that with their study in Oakland, California, and you really need to have this acceptance on the part of implementers. The more conflict you have in implementation, the less likely it is that implementation will actually happen. And so the federal government has this vested interest in avoiding conflict. And so as Karen took us through the discussion, there are many ways in which the federal government can try and mitigate conflict in the implementation of these federal programs, these federal policies. They can try and mitigate conflict through the creation of these agencies. They create agencies to implement these programs. They try and get state governments to be their allies in the implementation of these programs. When they need to, they will threaten the withholding of funds whenever the state or local governments are not doing what the federal government wants them to do. But as Karen points out, the problem with withholding of funds as one of those tools to get state and local governments to come into compliance with what the federal government wants is that if you actually do withhold the funds, you are making it more difficult to implement the program and achieve the objectives that you want to achieve. So instead, what you do is you threaten a withholding of the funds. And so I think it's a great article to show us that there are a lot of avenues that the federal government can pursue to get state and local governments to accomplish these federal objectives. And I think we see that a lot in our federal programs. As Karen correctly pointed out, the federal government is primarily involved in indirect administration, whereas state and local governments are involved in direct administration. So the federal government can create these agencies and then provide money for these agencies, and it's up to the state and local governments to get involved in that direct administration. And as Karen also pointed out, I think another really important aspect of the article is the whole idea of the blame game. As Karen finished up the discussion with that topic, I think that's a really important topic. That when you have grants and you have the federal government giving grants to state and local governments, then you allow all levels of government to play the blame game. So if goals are not being achieved, if programs are not being implemented properly, then the federal government will point their fingers at state and local governments and say, well, we gave the money, but state and local governments are messing up with the implementation. State governments will point back to the federal government and they'll say, well, we didn't get enough money from the federal government, or we didn't get the right kind of money from the federal government. And the state will then point the finger at local governments to say, well, the local governments aren't implementing it correctly either. So the federal government points down at state and local governments to point the blame. State governments can point up at the federal government with blame and point down at local governments with the blame. And the local governments can point up with blame to both the state as well as the federal government. So it really allows us in our federal system to shift responsibility back and forth to avoid accountability. And I think that's a really important point. It's a point that we're going to pick up on again as we move through a discussion of negotiation and bargaining in intergovernmental relations with some of our future articles. So that was wonderful. Thank you, Karen, very much. Very well done. Hit all the major points of the article. I appreciate that. Any further questions or follow-up on the Derthick article? If not, then we're going to reach back to Federalist 39, and that's Crystal's article, and we'll have Crystal take us through a discussion of Federalist number 39. So Crystal, the floor is yours. Crystal, are you there?
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Professor, is it okay? Can I go last?
Sure. Yeah, we can move things around. That shouldn't be a problem.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, we'll push you to last then. Then that means we will then move on to, I believe, Sam. And Sam has the governments as interest groups, the COMISA article. So Sam, I'll turn it over to you.
Sounds good. Thank you. Yeah, let me just share my screen here. Cool. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes, looks good.
Perfect. All right. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. So I'll be presenting on governments as interest groups. It's a relatively short article by Ann Camisa, and we'll kind of dive in with an introduction here. So when we're looking at this, we're looking at governments as interest groups. So I think typically when we think of interest groups, you might think of like lobbyists or like private interests that are being represented at the national government, usually acting on behalf of maybe like companies or firms looking for a very specific policy that they're trying to get implemented. Whereas this article is talking more about governments and how they function as interest groups. Specifically, they're looking at kind of state and local level, and these are associations of government officials that act as public interest groups. And the author went out of the way to point out that public interest is kind of subjective term to use for it, but typically these are regarded more as public interest groups just because they're governments trying to operate on behalf of a broad range of policies for their different governmental areas. And what that means for governmental areas is that typically they focus on spatial and functional interests. So spatial is like who implement the actual programs, and functional would be the actual policy areas that those topics focus on. And government interest groups can represent a broad range of different types of levels of governments. That can be, we'll dive into in a slide or two here, but just know that they can be state or local level, different types of public officials, even within a specific sector, that sort of thing. And typically they're not focused on just one policy issue. They actually focus on a broad range of policies. And one thing that the author mentioned I thought was kind of interesting to know was just that one way to think about it is that these government interest groups are lobbying the national government, and these interest groups themselves have been lobbied by other lobbyists. So they're the ones who are kind of taking everything that they've heard maybe at the state level or at a more local level, and then they're kind of passing it up as lobbyists in turn to the federal government a lot of the time. And so I kind of wanted to start off with the group here just to see if anyone had any, ideas of what are governmental interest groups, if they can think of any specific ones. I think Dr. Palavin maybe mentioned a few at the beginning of class today, or if maybe even anyone had experience with their organization participating in any lobbying efforts. I can give everyone kind of a minute to think about those if they had any responses.
Hey, Sam.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So because of the next discussion, I was kind of getting ahead and trying to figure out what groups I could write about, and I did find the National Association for County Community and Economic Development. So I thought that was pretty interesting. It's kind of a large group representing the local counties throughout America, but I'm still learning about it. So that's just one that I found out that existed.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's a great example. Thanks, Kamara. Yeah, that's kind of exactly what we're looking at here. And as far as the second one goes, I actually didn't have much experience with any individual one through my work, but my brother actually recently started working for a governmental lobbying group called the Rural Counties of, like a Rural County Association for California. I think it represents like 30 odd counties just within California that are considered rural. And so I thought that was interesting just because a lot of their lobbying efforts are focused just going from county to state level, and they're focusing on a lot of like economic development issues and things like that. But kind of before that, I hadn't had much experience with any organizations that were participating in this kind of governmental lobbying. And so the book kind of went out of its way to point out some specific, what they consider to be the 5 general government groups. They said there's kind of 2 types of major public interest groups that we consider. The first one being these 5 general government groups. So that's the National Governors Association, U.S. Conference of Mayors, National League of Cities, National Conference of State Legislatures, and the National Association of Counties. And then kind of building off of that, there's the different organizations that are made up of public officials. And so just a couple of the book mentioned were the American Public Welfare Association, National Association of Housing Redevelopment Officials, are a couple of them. But I just thought it was interesting because there's kind of as you can see here and kind of from that introductory slide, there is really a broad range of who these governmental interest groups represent. And so it's, across state, it's different types of elected officials. And it's also, probably focused on a wide variety of issues because what affects at the local county level is probably different than the state level and things like that. And also the public official organizations themselves, public welfare association, probably focusing on vastly different issues than the housing redevelopment officials. And so just kind of one quick question that you could put in the chat here, and just because we were just kind of going over, but just curious if anyone could name which one of these would be the governmental interest group from the four here. All right, I think we had a few roll in here. So it is the National Governors Association we discussed. The other ones are not, they're more private interest groups. And I put just a couple that were fairly well known. I actually put Facebook because I learned that last year they were the #1 lobbying group in terms of dollars spent in the US. So that was just interesting. But National Governors Association is the governmental interest group here. So then the article went on to discuss the different phases of intergovernmental lobbying. And they kind of discussed that really government as interest groups really began in the New Deal era. So during that time, there's large amounts of federal funding becoming available through different federal grant programs. And even during that time, there was this enhanced prestige of local mayors as they were kind of gaining prominence, at the local level within cities, but also these large amounts of federal grants meant that state governments and the different associations that encompass them were beginning to, lobby on behalf of how those dollars would be spent. So kind of focusing on those spatial issues of what authority they have over them. And really what the New Deal era kind of focused on initially was that there is this large amount of money incoming. But the book went on to note that there was also a lot of strings attached to this money that was going out to these governments. Kind of similar with the 1960s, actually. So the high federal funding did continue in the 60s. And there started to be competition for grants among these different governmental interest groups, and kind of focusing between the different states. There was this larger competition, but these first two phases were defined by these large amounts of funds that were being available. Also, there were strings attached to these funds. The third phase was interesting because there were still high levels of federal funding available. And it was at this time that really these organizations had established themselves as kind of prominent lobbying organizations. So like National Governors Association, the Mayors Association group as well, they were really gaining a lot of prominence on the national stage. And they claimed like revenue sharing as a policy success. They were really, I think, kind of firmly rooted as lobbyist organizations among governments. And one thing that's interesting to note is that this was during kind of the Nixon administration, and this was actually a time when there was high federal funding and fewer strings being attached to that money. So the states and local governments were given greater autonomy when it came how to administer those funds, which they viewed as a policy success as well, because kind of the big themes that the lobbyist organizations want is, higher funding and then less strings attached to those funds that they're receiving. And then the article went on to note that there was kind of a backlash to this in the 1980s, so that less federal funds were available. And they described this as kind of being something that was also political. So this was during Reagan administration, and he actually had a more confrontational attitude towards public interest lobbying groups, and typically viewed them as just kind of wanting to get more and more federal funding. So he didn't have a great view of them, which meant that a lot of their policy successes weren't able to continue into the 80s, and there was less federal funds. There was varying degrees of autonomy over those funds. So sometimes they would have more authority over the funds that they spent, like with welfare programs and things like that, but they were overall receiving less funds in total, which was kind of not what they had hoped to achieve with their policy programs. This did change a little bit during the 1990s. This is when Bill Clinton was elected. And so one thing to note about that is that he was actually the head of the National Governors Association previously. So he lended a lot of legitimacy to these organizations when he became president. And that's when they kind of still were undergoing like an economic downturn, but there was this varying levels of authority. So they were able to give a little bit more autonomy to these state governments at that point. And so just a quick check for the group, during which era did the first phase of intergovernmental lobbying begin? And feel free to throw a number in the chat there when you're ready. Sorry, my chat window has actually disappeared during my full screen mode here. So I'll just kind of keep it going here. But it was actually, yeah, during the New Deal era that this intergovernmental lobbying really began among the different governments, primary lobbying groups. And so one thing to note was that this article was written in the mid-90s, and so that's kind of when they stopped talking about the different phases. During the mid-90s, there was an economic downturn. So there were federal deficit, state fiscal crises. Another thing to note is that federal grants were declining overall. So there was less money to go around during this as well. And this is when state and local groups really go into a more defensive posture and trying to push for new programs and trying to increase their lobbying efforts to make sure that they're able to maintain current funding and get additional funds, and just really trying to make sure that they're doing as much as they can on their own behalf to administer these programs with greater funds and with greater autonomy kind of being their two biggest goals typically. But kind of building off of that, I was just curious if people had any thoughts on, obviously a lot has changed since 95. So just curious if people think that the US is in a different phase, if we feel like there's a lot of federal funds available, do we feel like states or local governments have more or less autonomy, and just kind of maybe think about all the changes that have happened since this article was written, if there was any thoughts on how we feel.
I'll chime in with, I think there's a ton of funds lately, just perhaps because of COVID relief and how broad an umbrella that sort of reached. So like I work a lot with schools, and there was all this like education funding to the district, like emergency funding for COVID, construction of different, I don't know, air filtration systems and testing. And then the county, I know, has had a ton of funds come in for various COVID relief. So maybe it's just maybe a COVID specific flood of federal dollars that have come in, but it does seem like there's an awful lot. I've dabbled in grants as well, and there has been a really decent amount coming through the pipeline, but I don't know historically if that's less or more.
Yeah, no, thanks, Christine. I think that's kind of exactly along the lines of what I was thinking. I think it's a lot of interesting times now because, yeah, I think COVID-19 really did spur a lot of like federal grant packages and other things like that that the state and counties and cities are using. I know with like my department, for instance, the Department of Food and Ag, like we have a lot of federal opportunities that are just coming out every month. It seems like for more and more funds that are either going to state or local level or nonprofits, things like that. And there's typically not a lot of too many strings attached to these funds. They seem to be relatively easy to apply for because I think there's just such large amounts of funds available right now. They're just trying to get it out there. But yeah, no, thanks. That was a great response. All right. One other note that the article had was on the effectiveness of public interest groups. And so one thing they wanted to kind of reiterate within the article was that public interest groups are most effective when they are fully aligned on an issue. And so typically what this means is that if there's any legislation that they're pushing for as an interest group, it will probably fail if there is disagreement within the interest group. So when looking at things like the National Government Association or some of these large kind of nationwide ones, there's obviously a lot of room for potential along political lines, along a lot of ideological views that maybe they don't fully agree on a policy. And when that happens, the book noted that there is just a very low chance that they're going to get the policy passed at a federal level, and they actually become blockers to their own policy objectives if there's dissent in the group. And so typically, this is when you'll see legislation fail if it's part of their lobbying agenda, if there starts to become cracks in kind of their unity.
She was like,
and then one other thing that was noted is that they will typically take advantage of windows of opportunity that appear. And so if there's, for instance, a lot of federal funding as there is currently, this is when state and local governments will really try and make sure that they get as many of those funds as they can, and really looking along the lines of, trying to increase the amount of federal funds they receive through typically grants, and then also with the fewer strings attached, so greater autonomy. And that goes back to the spatial issue. So that's one thing to remember is like spatial is the maintaining authority over their own geographic sphere and being the ones to actually administer and control kind of the funds that come their way. And so because the article was relatively short, I think it was only about 4.5 pages, I just wanted to take a quick dive into some of the current agendas for public interest groups, so some of these governmental interest groups that are around, and just curious if anyone had any thoughts on maybe what are some of the highlighted issues for the National Governors Association. Just from looking at their website, I was able to find a few.
I would say abortion's one of them, I think.
Yeah. Anyone else have any ideas on some of the issues that they would be highlighting?
Immigration reform.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of redistricting and all these election kind of laws, because they're all trying to build their power base.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks everyone. Yeah, I think they actually have a pretty broad agenda. So I think that all these are on their website. I think that they kind of actually are advocating for all of those that you've mentioned. The two that they kind of put as they're highlighted within their website, and I don't know if these are their actual priorities or not. They're just kind of the ones that stood out on their website when you click into their policy objectives. But one was the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act of 2022 and the Chips and Science Act. And so the first one, and especially in light of recent tragedies as well, they were really focusing on combating gun violence and trying to include provisions for public safety. And then the Chips and Science Act was focused on federal aid for construction of microprocessing manufacturing facilities in the US. And so just kind of looking at their agenda, some of the things that you've mentioned, and kind of remembering the earlier slide about, if a unified front is how they're most effective in lobbying, how much of a role do people think politics play with different levels of intergovernmental lobbying? No worries, I can kind of speak to it too if people are thinking. I would say that politics plays a large role, especially given that when you look across the different, at the state level, even the different legislatures that are in control, different parties for governor, things like that, it's kind of a big one. And it can be hard for them to probably present kind of a unified policy outlook, just because of the fact that they are trying to deal with such a huge geographic area for some of these organizations and kind of different constituencies involved in those. But I would say that politics overall probably plays a pretty big role in their policies that they decide to align on. And so just curious, you can type in the chat, kind of building off of that, what do people think that the Conference of Mayors focuses on? Do you think that they're pretty similar issues to the National Governors Association, or because it's a more local level, do you think some of their top highlighted issues are pretty different? Feel free to just throw a number in the chat there. I think I've skipped ahead a couple of slides there accidentally. All right, there we go. Got some of the control back. So actually, some of their current highlighted lobbying efforts is, these are kind of the top 5 that they list on their website. And there is some overlap, but they actually have kind of a different range of topics that they were focusing on altogether, which was, one was the American Rescue Plan. So that was focusing on a lot of additional federal funds that have become available. COVID-19 relief as well, which is kind of an ongoing issue across everywhere in the US for several years now. Reducing gun violence, so that one has direct overlap with some of the National Governors Association priorities. And they've also gone on to list police reform and racial justice and election security as 2 of their other top issues among mayors. The book did note that typically the US Mayors Group has been more Democratic leaning, just because they're typically focusing on like larger urban areas that have a lot of the representation there. But I thought it was just interesting how there was a little bit of overlap with the National Governors Association for some of their top issues, but then also some of these more local issues as well. that come up. I think police reform and racial justice is a big one at the local level, especially. Just curious, though, kind of building off of the other question too from the slide before, do these seem like issues that will get pretty good alignment across the U.S. Mayor's organization, or do people think that these are ones where there might be like competing views among the different cities that the mayors would represent?
I would say that there's probably a lot of competing views since it's all over the US. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think, yeah, one of the big takeaways from the article and kind of looking at their agenda, their issues here, is that there sure is a big difficulty in trying to make sure that there's, you know, broader alignment across these different organizations. And that's when a lot of their difficulties can come into play, is just making sure that things that are on their agenda are things that they can get the full backing of their membership, so they can be most successful lobbying at the federal level. And so just wanted to note a few key takeaways from this article. So I think the biggest takeaway is just that government associations can act as interest groups. They typically act as in the public interest, is the way that it's often referred to as. And they're different associations of public officials, like governors, mayors, state legislatures, things like that, or more specific policy-oriented folks. And then they typically focus on a variety of functional and spatial issues. So functional being more of those policy issues, and spatial being the administration of those, and kind of who actually is the one to have control and authority over their geographic sphere. Another key takeaway is that there's been different phases throughout the decades. So depending on, you know, politics, federal funding, administrative freedom, that really does change between the different decades on what type of intergovernmental lobbying is taking place between these associations and the federal government. And then one of the last key takeaways is just that government groups are most effective when membership is fully aligned. And that's when they're typically able to get policies passed in their favor, or if they're not aligned, that's when they may end up being a blocker actually for them. And with that, that concludes my article. Thank you for the participation, everyone.
Great job, Sam. Well done. Hit all the major points of the article. I think it is a fascinating article, as you point out, because we oftentimes don't think about governments from that political perspective. We think about politicians obviously being very political. We don't think about governments really being political. And I think what you have with these governmental interest groups, these public interest groups, is you kind of had a confluence of events that occurred. You had the New Deal, as Sam talked about, in the New Deal era. You have all of this additional money that's starting to flow out of Washington, D.C. And so when the money's flowing out of Washington, D.C., there's then an imperative for state and local governments to have a presence in Washington, D.C. to try and lobby for more of that money. And so that's when you start to see a lot of this centralization of moving toward Washington, D.C. on part of these groups to try and get access to some of this additional money. So I think that's one thing that had occurred. I think another thing that occurred is that you have a situation where you've got all these crisis situations happening, and a lot of states and a lot of cities started seeing some commonalities in terms of some of the problems they were facing and ways to overcome those problems, which kind of speaks to joining together into these groups. And so you see these groups really start to migrate toward Washington, D.C. And so you have the National League of Cities, the National Governors Association, that built these kind of palatial offices in Washington, D.C. If you've ever been to the National Governors Association office in Washington, D.C., it's a beautiful building. There's marble. It's very, very nice. A lot of money went into it. And so they started to migrate to Washington to focus their lobbying on Congress. Then, as Sam points out, then you've got the 1980s, the Reagan administration comes along, and then you've got a decentralization. As we talked about the different areas of federalism, we said in the Nixon and Reagan administration, you have this push toward a decentralization of decision-making back to state governments. So you end up with kind of a mismatch in that all of these organizations like NLC and NGA, they have moved their operations to Washington, D.C. to lobby Congress. And then you have the national government saying, well, we're going to turn over authority and decision-making to state governments. So they're kind of out of position to take advantage of that. You can contrast that with an organization such as a National Conference of State Legislatures, the NCSL, and the National Conference of State Legislatures actually moved their operations back to the state level. And they moved their operations to Lexington, Kentucky. So they kind of took advantage of this idea of decentralization and that states would have more of a role in decision making. But when we talk about these organizations as engaging in political activities, it really does underscore the different ways we define federalism. So in the last 2 weeks, we were defining federalism as constitutional federalism. And again, when we define it as constitutional federalism, state and local governments can find protection in the courts. They can say, well, what Congress is doing is unconstitutional, and so we can go the judicial route in order to get protection. But once we start to define federalism as political, that's when there's much more of a role for these types of public interest groups, because they then have to take on the role of lobbying Congress. And that's why these public interest groups have become very prominent today. Another important point, as Sam correctly pointed out, is the spatial aspect of these public interest groups. The public interest groups are different than your traditional interest group. A traditional interest group is going to focus on a specific issue and they're trying to accomplish a goal with a specific issue. Public interest groups have a much broader type of agenda and they have much more spatial interests in that they are lobbying on behalf of a government and a set of governments. And so they're oftentimes looking more at how policies are being implemented, those nuts and bolts of regulations, those nuts and bolts of implementation. So they're lobbying for different things than what a traditional interest group would be lobbying for. And I think that some of these interest groups have had some success. You know, the National League of Cities had some relative success with the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act and getting that passed in the mid-1990s. Some other interest groups have been a little bit less successful. And one example of that, the National Governors Association. Sometimes the NGA has a lot of trouble coming to agreement among its membership about what types of issues it should be trying to promote and how it should be lobbying. Because I think, as the author points out, the National Governors Association is basically a collection of 50 different prima donnas. I'm here talking about 50 different governors who are chief executives of their states. And so it's kind of difficult to get them to all fall in line. It's kind of like herding cats when you're dealing with 50 state governors. And so I think the composition of those groups really goes a long way to helping explain how
Did we lose connection?
Yeah, it looks like it's frozen.
I think Professor has problems with his internet connection. Sam, so going along with your along your presentation, how much divisive politics do they have in the Governors Federation? Or is it broken along the lines of party lines, or are they having a unified agenda?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know if I got too far into how successful they are at it, but it looked like just from their highlighted issues, I was kind of surprised that they were focusing on some of the ones that they were. So I think they actually did get a pretty good job of getting unity across the governors. But yeah, I don't know if they're successful or not, though.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, everybody. I think I dropped out. I apologize for that. I lost my internet connection. So can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I do apologize, but we'll pick up from there. Again, Sam, thank you very much. You did a great job. Again, it's a fascinating article. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, I do recommend that everyone takes a look at it, because it's really a different way of thinking about how governments participate in our system of intergovernmental relations. Okay, let's go ahead then and move on to our next article. And that is Monica with Ann Bowman article. So Monica, the floor is yours.
Alrighty, and you can see my screen all right?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to be covering the trends and issues in interstate cooperation. And my name is Monica Torres, and let's get started. So really in the United States, states can be seen as both rivals and allies. So they're in this interesting position where it creates a fragile equilibrium. States are constantly competing and cooperating with one another. And there's a constant competition for economic development because states do depend on their own sources of revenue. But since the colonial period, states have been able to cooperate and they've found it necessary and appropriate to do so. And this has created many interstate connections. And the basic rules for interacting among the states were set in the Constitution. So the full faith and credit clause found in Article 4, Section 1 makes it so that citizens of every state are bound to the laws and policies of other states. In Article 4, Section 2, we see that the interstate rendition clause, which requires that fugitives from justice in one state who have fled to another state be returned upon request of the governor. Also in Article 4, Section 2, citizens of one state are guaranteed fundamental rights of citizens in other states. And in Article 1, Section 10, it provides a mechanism through which states can address shared problems and establishes a formal provision for interstate compacts, which we will cover as we go along. Article 3, Section 2 assigns controversies between two or more states to the federal judiciary for resolution. And in Article 1, Section 8, it has a provision authorizing Congress to regulate interstate commerce to maintain a system of free trade among the states. Lastly, the Constitution states the legal equality of each state. And from these rules set in the Constitution, we kind of got to the point where we are of interstate relations. These are kind of the foundation for that. So just to kind of get started here, just a true or false that you can drop in the chat. True or false, the 200-year-old conflict between New York and New Jersey over the ownership of Ellis Island was finally resolved in 1997 by the US Supreme Court. And yeah, I see a couple of truths. Yeah, it is true. It is true. And this is an example of how Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution is at use, where if there's a controversy or some kind of issue between two states, the federal judiciary system has to step in to solve that. Thank you for participating. So interacting states. States act in self-interest when they're interacting with one another. So they're going to pursue opportunities and resist obstacles. States are going to cooperate with other states when it's perceived to be in their best interest. And then they're going to clash with other states when it's going to benefit them. So cooperative behavior emerge in win-win situations when states work together on a common problem or a shared objective. And when states enter into competitive behavior by going after a prize or a position, it tends to end up in a zero-sum outcome. And in these situations, external actors such as government institutions can determine winners and losers. There are times when the situation can be unmediated, such as in the open market. And when this happens, when it's unmediated, it can be unproductive and costly to the states. So sometimes the states will kind of change direction and start cooperating so that it's not as costly to them. And it's this type of push and pull of competition and cooperation that creates a constantly evolving interstate equilibrium. And it's an interesting balance because when states can't reach a solution, the article kind of described as that they have to keep in mind that a state-led solution is preferable to a federally imposed one. So it's better for them to resolve their issues with each other than for the federal government to have to step in and impose a solution. But it is often in those issues that affect vital state interests that it's most difficult to reach a common agreement. So it's a little bit of a situation. So another true or false, states competing for tourism or for firms to come to their state would be an example of open market competition. I want to see a true opinion. Yeah, and it is true. So this is the type of situation where it would be unmediated and the states kind of have to figure it out amongst themselves. Whereas like if it's for grants, the government can kind of come in and figure it out for them. All right, so interstate cooperation. States must consider the costs and benefits of collective action when deciding whether or not to join other states. Any self-interested state is going to participate in actions where the anticipated gains are going to outweigh any potential losses. And we're going to look at 3 forms of interstate cooperation, and these include interstate compacts, multi-state legal action, and adoption of uniform state laws. And then just in the chat, you can enter the number of which one you believe is the most common form of interstate cooperation. 1 for interstate compacts, 2 for multi-state legal actions, and 3 for adoption of uniform state laws. One, 2, another one. Okay. So we'll move on with the presentation and see if we get an answer to that question. So starting off with interstate compacts, this is the traditional mechanism of cooperation among states. It's a formal agreement or contract between 2 or more states. And a state's approval of a compact makes the agreement legally binding on the participants. In the compact, you can find policies for state compliance and the terms for states' withdrawal from the compact. And historically, these were used for territorial border agreements, but lately the compacts have gained more of an administrative, financial, substantive, and technical dimensions. So they've evolved and changed from originally being to settle border disputes to what they come to be today. And so compacts do require approval of member states' legislature, which can bog down the process and makes things a little bit slower and more complicated. So there are a few compacts that require congressional consent. And when they do, it's even more of a lengthy process. And as of 2003, there were 155 compacts in existence. And the average number of compact membership for the states was 25.4 compacts per state. So 57 of the 155 compacts were only between 2 states. So while anyone can join compacts, only 10% of compacts had the majority of the states as members. And there were only 2 compacts that had all 50 states as members, which were the Interstate Compact on the Placement of Children and the Uniform Interstate Compact on Juveniles. So the promise of compacts as an instrument of national policy is kind of not that there. They're more particular in what they're used for, since there's only 2 that all states are a part of. Okay. The next thing we're going to cover is multi-state lawsuits. And if anyone wants to share, maybe in the chat or unmute themselves, why do you think that multiple states would enter into a lawsuit as a form of cooperation? I'll give you all a couple of seconds to kind of think it over. So remember, they're cooperating. So why would they want to go into a lawsuit together? The form of cooperation.
Is it because maybe they're working together in favor or against a certain issue?
Yes, that's exactly it. So When there's a multi-state legal action, the states are entering into a lawsuit with other states, and they're with them, they're not against one another. And it's legal action that gets a group going because a state just by itself might not be a significant challenge to, let's say, a private sector firm, but a group of states poses more of a threat. So by acting together and seeking joint legal action, states can assert and protect their role in the federal system and basically beat the national government to address specific problems. And two examples included in the text include a lawsuit against the tobacco industry and a lawsuit against Microsoft in 1998. And for Microsoft, it was due to the illegal anti-competitive, anti-consumer actions by the corporation. And so there is this association, the National Association of Attorneys General, which is composed of chief legal counsels of states and territories, which they basically spearhead the push for multi-state legal action. And they take policy positions and issue guidelines, but they tend to avoid official action on issues that divide membership. So similar to multi-state compacts, the legal action joins states on an issue of common interest, such as protecting consumers from fraudulent practices or products. And by joining together, the states can find strength in numbers. And on average, a state was a party to multi-state legal action on 25 occasions. This article is a little bit older, so it kind of focused most of its data in the 1990s. And from what it said, there was a trend in increase in the rate of multi-state lawsuits during this decade. So it was being used more and more. But it didn't give a number as to how many multi-state lawsuits were like all the states participated. So didn't get an answer to that. Okay, so the next type of cooperation is uniform state laws. In this third form of cooperation, states adopt a uniform statute. And by having their law be the same as other states, each state is endorsing and embracing a peer established norm. And it's different from the previous two forms of cooperation since it doesn't involve the same type of collective action. Give me 1 second, my mouse is gone. There it is. Sorry about that. So it's different from the previous two forms of cooperation because it doesn't involve the same type of collective action. It isn't the states banding together against like some type of common interest where they're protecting consumers or anything like that. Basically, it's having the same law as another state so that you reduce the difference between states. And in that way, it does capture the spirit of cooperation is how the article put it. And there's this nonprofit organization called the National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws. And it was created in 1892 to draft uniform statutes for the states. It's made up of attorneys, judges, and legal experts from each state, and they basically draft laws, and then each state has the option of enacting it and thereby conforming their law to the other states. And as of when this article is written, there were 22 new uniform laws finalized by this organization, and states on average adopted 7.7 of them. New Mexico had the highest with 14, while on the other end of the spectrum, Georgia, Massachusetts, and New York and Wisconsin only had 4 each. So it's kind of varied in the level of participation. And just from the, the organization's website, I found their kind of little blurb about who they are They basically provide states with nonpartisan, well-conceived and well-drafted legislation that brings clarity and stability to critical areas of state statutory law. So when we look at all three, for each state, the level of cooperation behaviors tends to depend on the specific form of cooperation. There isn't like a specific trend where, oh, all states are doing more of this one, or all states are doing more of that one. A state tends not to pursue all three types with the same degree of enthusiasm. And some of the examples that they gave was that Wisconsin was low in interstate compact membership and uniform law, but high in the involvement of joint legal action. Whereas Colorado was high in compact and uniform law adoption, but was low in multi-state legal action. New York was another state with a top group in joint lawsuits and compacts, but it was very low on uniform law enactments. And Idaho, Ohio, Oregon, and Tennessee had an average form of cooperation in all categories, whereas Georgia and South Carolina showed a limited willingness to cooperate with other states. They were pretty much low in all three of the types. So overall, it just kind of shows that states tend not to pursue all types of cooperation at the same level. And when it comes to future prospects, again, this is during the 1990s, the frequency of multi-state lawsuits and the number of asserting states increased. So that was the one that they saw was most on the rise or increasing the most was multi-state lawsuits. And its desire to do business nationally that puts pressure on states to conform, so that if they have, let's say, the same law in one state versus another, then it kind of makes it easier for private firms to do business in their states because everything's the same. Whereas if there's differences in each state, then it makes it more complicated for them. And state adoption of uniform laws, like I said, is not very popular, and it doesn't appear that states are looking to adopt laws that would bring their statutes in line. There's an increase of 10% of interstate compacts since the mid-1990s. And while interstate compacts are appropriate in instances in which complex legal or fiscal issues exist, it's looking like there's more of these administrative agreements that can be effective alternatives to them because they're easier to initiate, negotiate, and amend. And this flexibility is a real advantage. So the state willingness to cooperate and can lead with the book or the article called To Federalism Without Washington. So basically meaning that states can work together to solve major national issues without the federal government having to step in. And it provides an alternative to federal legislation. And it also stated that it can forestall deferral preemption of the states. So because states are not only allies, they're also rivals, sustained cooperative action is not always present. And as a final question, just kind of as a review, which of these is not a type of state cooperation? A, compacts, B, deals and treaties, C, legal action, or D, uniform laws? These. Yes, the correct answer is B, deals and treaties. I made that one up. And that is all for my presentation. Thank you for listening.
And thank you very much, Monica. I apologize. I dropped out for about a minute or so. I don't know what's going on with my internet connection. So if I go again, I just lost my internet and I'll be right back. But thank you very much. That was well done. You covered all the important aspects of the article. Those three forms of cooperation, again, are very important ways in which states work together. Interstate compacts, that's one that used to be very popular for states. And as Monica pointed out, some states are more inclined to use one as opposed to the other two approaches. And so states that typically use interstate compacts tend to kind of stick with that as their approach. Some interstate compacts have been very successful, some have been less so. A lot of it depends upon the issue and the composition of that compact. And I've got a couple of examples, but because of the internet connection time, I won't go into them. But it's a very common traditional way in which states work together. The uniform state legislation, that is something that we have seen most recently. One very common example of that, or one very recent example of that, is in terms of taxing the internet and how states all joined together in the streamlined sales tax project to put together uniform legislation to allow them to have access to taxing remote sales. And that was a really prominent example recently of putting together uniform legislation, in that they put together a uniform piece of legislation that each member state would then pass into law. And hopefully the idea was, by having all of these states with the same piece of uniform legislation, that could then induce Congress to go ahead and allow states to tax the internet. The third one, as Monica pointed out, is the one that is growing much more quickly than the other two. And that's this multi-state legal action. And I think multi-state legal action is really predicated upon the state attorney general. And we've seen several state attorneys general who have been elected who are very proactive, who are very willing to take on these fights and take on corporations. And the more proactive your state attorney general is, the more likely your state will be involved in that multi-state legal action. And I think what we've seen is more and more proactive state attorneys general, and that's why we've seen more and more of these multi-state legal actions. But again, the moral of the story is that states tend to stick with the form of cooperation that they've had the most success with and that they are most comfortable with. But thank you, Monica, very well done. It's good that we have this primer in terms of how states do cooperate with each other, because as we move forward with some of our future articles, we'll point out some issues that make it difficult for states to work together and to cooperate together to contend against the federal government. Let's see, it's we'll call it 7:25. Let's go ahead and take a break. And hopefully during the break, I'll be able to troubleshoot whatever issues are going on here with the internet. I'll try and get my Ethernet going, and hopefully that will help. Let's take, let's say, a 15-minute break, and then when we come back, we will have Janine up on deck to then take us through the Beyond Preemption article, and then we'll wrap up the show tonight with Crystal and the discussion of Federalist 39. So take 15 minutes, come on back at 7:40, and we will get started again with Janine. Okay, well, it's 7:40, so we are back from break. I am now connected to Ethernet, so hopefully that will keep me connected for a while. I thought I was connected to begin the class, and for some reason it didn't connect, but looks like it's connected now. So I'll turn it over to Janine to talk to us about the Beyond Preemption article.
Thank you, Professor. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So just a little bit here about preemption. As Monica had mentioned previously at the end of her article, it has to do with a little bit of what the federal government has in terms of power. And so in Beyond Preemption, Intergovernmental Partnerships to Enhance the New Economy, John Dewitt, Carl Stenberg, and Charles Wise really define preemption as these actions that the national government is taking to substitute nationwide policies and programs for those of states and localities, and prohibit states and localities from exercising certain power that have previously been their responsibility. So up until the 1945, preemptions were actually infrequent by the federal government. It wasn't until there was this arisal of of preemptions that became, kind of like the norm that we see now. So a couple of examples would be if we look at, well, first of all, if you can name some examples of preemptions that you've seen, I'll give you like a huge one that we've seen recently, which would be like COVID-19 regulations in terms of like the mask mandates. Are there any other examples that you can think of recently? And you can type them in the chat if you don't want to unmute yourself. Okay, well, I'll drop a big hint on preemptions. So some of the preemptions that are currently in the news, we're talking about like abortion rights, right? Roe versus Wade. That was on a national scale of now giving the power to the states to dictate what they can do about regarding abortion. Another one that we saw was DACA, right? Which allowed children who came here as children undocumented to have rights within this country and the capacity to work and have, a social security card. So two examples of preemptions that I want to go deeper within are the COVID-19 pandemic response really gave a lot of power to the federal government in terms of enacting preemptions. So when we were talking about the mask mandates, the CDC was the one that regulated this, even when the White House at that time was, did not really want to have that. There were operating hours of like who can open, who cannot open the stores, right? Which businesses were allowed, which businesses were dictated as emergency, right? And so there were a lot of workforce policy changes that also came from that. People who had no way of staying at home, right? Who couldn't work from home. These were, the medics, the fast food workers, people who were cleaning, basically all these essential workers. They had to enact workforce policies from the preemptions that the national government was giving. And then of course we have the vaccine mandates. So in the vaccine mandates, again, came from a national level, and then they were going down to the state and then local levels. In terms of these, how did any of these pandemic preemptions affect your workplace? And do you think that the preemptions were a little bit out of touch to what was actually going on during the pandemic? If you guys want to recall back to the crazier times early in the pandemic, how did these affect your workplace?
I can chime in. So for the nonprofit that I was working at, it was providing services like hot meals to homeless people and rental assistance. So it was still very much, we have to go to the office. Everyone has to try to be as safe as possible. Mm-hmm. So it did affect us in the way that we had to take those precautionary measures, but it didn't like send everyone to work from home.
Got it. So Faisal wrote down, we are a public utility, pandemic or not, we had to work. Yeah. So there's definitely a lot of mixed versions, right? And a lot of different scenarios for people within the workforce. So one example of how a preemption actually could be a little bit more damaging was because it does have like a blanketed, level of like, here's a policy, there is no challenging it or, fighting the status quo because it comes from higher government, is that when there was a law that came into effect from the pandemic stating that people who worked in the healthcare had to be vaccinated and boosted. So I was working at a mental health company at that time, and I had actually had allergic reactions to both the vaccines. So I was unable to get the booster because I felt really unsafe. Like my throat closed up. I had to go to the hospital. And I was like, yeah, I don't want to get the vaccine, like the booster, like for the third time or the third vaccine because of, because I felt unsafe. So my work actually had to, or the company had to let me go because by law, they were required to have everybody who worked within the mental health, who qualified under healthcare, to be boosted. And I was really upset because for me, it didn't make sense that I wasn't working with anybody who was at risk. I literally had my own private office. I could just come in. I could work from home most of the time. So that preemption really didn't take into account people who worked like at the office setting within the healthcare system. So it really, I feel like it was really out of touch from what was actually going on. I think they could have had a little bit more, you know, a little bit more inferences in the policy decision making that was there. So another example that is currently in the works, at least from what I'm seeing within the city of Long Beach, is the state bill 1383, which requires that local municipalities collect organic waste material and require large-scale businesses to reduce food waste and divert leftovers. So for this one, it is a huge undertaking that is coming from the state to the local municipalities. And so I feel like it's not really gonna be effective unless there's a huge culture change and education process behind that. Instead of requiring, you know, what they're saying is like, you have to do this, or, you know, people are gonna get fined. So how effective do you perceive SB 1383 being? If anybody has had any, you know, direct contact or direct examples working within municipal government.
Hi, Janine, this is Bernie.
Hi.
Well, it depends, obviously, with the first 2 years of this law being, you know, heavily reliant on education, and then starting in 2024 by the state then requiring the local jurisdictions to impose penalties and fines. It'll be tough to tell. Obviously, we've been 11 months into our program for the city that I work for, and doing the initial assessment, contamination monitoring. I mean, we are seeing that a lot of folks are still not complying. They're still throwing, for example, food waste in the regular trash containers.
Right.
And these are things that, you know, we have another 12 months coming up that we're going to have to provide the education. Otherwise, we're going to start issuing fines and penalties. And it's going to lead to an uproar in the community where our elected officials here in our city are going to feel the heat. But similar to the stormwater regulations, we're simply going to say this is a state mandate and we're just simply required to do this. Otherwise, we as a city get penalized and fined.
Right. Yeah, same. And Faisal wrote, our city provided containers to dispose food waste. We don't know how effective this is. Definitely within my community here, I live in a condominium, and the complex was given like these tinier, smaller green dumpsters. And every day that I go, they're just filled with regular trash. And so I'm looking at it, it's like, oh, we never got a notice. The HOA never sent out flyers. So there's definitely like a lack of communication. But again, it's coming from this bigger law, as opposed to having, you know, cities and local communities work out, you know, a way to reduce carbon emissions in providing greenhouse or the green waste to divert somewhere else. So preemptions are basically, you know, all of these different situations where the government is enacting these laws and policies. So the paper finds 6 findings. And basically the first finding from the panel claims that there has been a rise in federal preemptions. And these preemptions have increased likely because of the technological advances. So obviously news travels faster almost instantly from the federal government. There isn't a day in the White House that, you know, there is not a tweet or, you know, a press conference that are streamed where we get our news from the federal government. So we're really tied to what the president says, right? What Congress is coming up. At least those of us who are more politically inclined, we're very virtually, like, you know, at the moment's notice. So one can be virtually in any part of the country and be connected to the federal government. And The finding states that because of the laws, there have been inconsistency, even clashing laws from the federal and state laws. And the prime example, of course, is marijuana, which is still illegal in the federal level, but legal in many states for both medical and recreational use. So the pandemic, again, brought an onslaught of preemptions, and the rise was due to the international crisis. And for the past 40 years, it has had its fair share of crises that would obviously contribute to the increase in preemptions. According to the article, preemptions have been a result of political pressure as well. So the Center of Disease Control and Prevention enacted the mask mandate again for the entire country back when the pandemic started. And the White House administration at that time was against the mask mandate. And the president's party really politicized the mask wearing. And it was so polarized that, you know, the first time that the president at that time wore a mask, it made like headlines because like that's how polarized it was. So the second finding is that there has been a centralization of powers, and this gives more power to the federal government and removes local and state government and agencies. So again, the pandemic provided an example on how on the national level, there were federal policies regarding the vaccines, distancing, the masks, and they were disconnected at the local level. And that's the example that I brought in about the mental health agency being disconnected, saying, hey, you have to get the vaccine. It's like, well, I feel like I don't need it because I'm not at risk and I'm not, you know, in direct contact with clients. But again, so that's where I can see a disconnect in the centralization of power being disconnected from the locality of where laws and federal policies should be building up to. The third finding is that these preemptions undermine service capacity during the pandemic. So businesses had to implement 6 feet of space, right? And had to force workers to mask up, to provide hand sanitizers and other requirements. And at the beginning of the pandemic, there were multiple shortages of sanitizing supplies, leaving some businesses unable to comply with federal regulations. So I think these preemptions, such as these, need state and local governments to really work together to provide either funding or, you know, different types of services that would help in you know, regulating these. And so the third finding also states that there's these new style of federal preemptions that set arbitrary limits. And successful federal policies are often developed through other governments, state and local, that can prove results. So programs are developed from these beneficial alternatives. So one state proposition example that I can think of is the Proposition 29 that just failed to pass. So this one would have required that dialysis clinics have a physician, a nurse practitioner, or a PA during the treatment hours on site. And so this proposition undermined the service capacity for dialysis centers that may not have been able to bring a physician on board. So you can already think about, well, we do have a doctor shortage, right? We have a medical system that has been impacted because of the pandemic. And it would be really difficult. So most of these dialysis centers maybe would be shutting down. So this proposition was obviously stopped on the ballot this past election by voters, and it gave us an example of how the public can help implement a state law. And again, this was the third time that the ballot came up to the voters, and it was struck down again. So dialysis facilities have lobbied against the ballot initiative because it would cost them financially. So the panel finds that preemptions have been undermining the service capacity of the different organizations, right? They're giving us, you know, these requirements that we may not be able to have. The fourth findings shows that the financial impact with the preemptions, where state and local governments are often financially burdened. So the budgets for city and state government are relying on federal funds to complete programs. However, not all preemptions come with funding. So we can see that with SB 1383, right, where we're given, you know, these laws on how to collect organic waste material. And it's not like they're giving us, you know, a lot of funding to say, okay, well, don't charge your people, don't charge, you know, don't add another burden to your constituents. Here, just collect it for free for the environment because we want to save Mother Earth. Like that is completely not here or there. But yeah, so they definitely don't, the preemptions are not giving that financial support. And so it is rising the state and the local economy to have a tighter budget and to create different ways of how to pay for things. So the cost for collecting the organic waste is set to increase, especially here in Long Beach. I know that the director for public works was really upset and saying, I don't know who came up with this law, but it's really burdening, the city, and it's gonna have a dramatic increase that constituents are really gonna feel the price. So the fifth finding is having, describes the panel describes it as having an option for joint action, which means that the joint action will look like partial preemptions, federal and state performance partnerships, uniform state laws, interstate compacts, and federal incentives to encourage consistent state action. So while we do appreciate, a blanketed federal law, there is a lot of room to make that law that would work for everyone, right? Even if it's just a little bit, or give room to wiggle or to move around or to create different exceptions for those who have, certain criteria. So I think I don't know why, but I feel like I would consider myself more of a federalist person. Like, yes, let's have everybody have equal law, but I feel like it's only because I would want the laws that I would want federally, right? Because then it's like, no, we want state rights as well. So it's definitely a juggle of having both, which is very, very interesting, at least for this country. So the sixth finding is that the intergovernmental data and research do not have the capacity to assess the federalism that we have now. So federal agencies with intergovernmental relations responsibilities have federalism assessment responsibilities as well. And these agencies may not be understanding or meeting those requirements. And that's solely because funding for these programs or departments have decreased and data shortage fails on providing more innovative federal preemption. So we definitely have a lot of work to do in terms of moving together from these preemptions. So in terms of the findings, what do you think of these findings? And on a scale of 1 through 5, how relevant are these findings today, with 1 being not at all relevant and 5 being very relevant? And this is kind of just to test the waters. There's no right or wrong answer, and you can go ahead and input the number on the chat. All right, so Faisal said it was a 3, somewhat relevant. Faisal, would you like to share a little bit about why you find that these findings are somewhat relevant?
Well, I'm thinking along the lines of the trash example that you mentioned. Well, we know that it's a problem that needs to be resolved. Mm-hmm. But then it's an overall issue. It's not, it can be a regional issue, but also it can be a, if you had read some of the case studies from before, mm-hmm. we might even export the trash to another state, mm-hmm. So it could become a regional issue. So there is things that we need to sort out within our borders. And again, sometimes if we couldn't, then it'll trickle down, in different directions. So, and then again, I wanted to share that thinking about along the lines of the trash, again, mm-hmm. On that, how can we police that? Like, are we going to put people to check everybody's trash cans? And is that feasible? Will it really bring the benefits, economic benefits? Who's going to pay for those? How is it going to be effective? Whether that law is going to be effective is a big question to me.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for sharing. Yes, I definitely agree that these findings are somewhat relevant to today's political climate, I think, because that moves us on to the panel's recommendations. So the panel moves on providing 6 recommendations to assist in preemption reduction. So at the end of the day, we don't want to see preemptions because We don't want to see the government overreaching onto states' rights and locals' rights. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we're able to work together and have a new strategy. So it argues that federal preemptions should be used seldomly. And the first recommendation calls for a new intergovernmental partnership enacted by Congress and a federalism action plan powered by the national associations representing state and local agencies. So again, it's that intergovernmental relationships that really partner between the different levels of government that can fuel the cooperation and partnerships. So this is very suggestive that current leadership is not representing local issues. And I feel like Congress is supposed to represent the states, and Congress members should be advocating for their districts at a national level. And so even within state legislation, state assembly members and senators should be listening to their municipal leaders, to actual constituents dealing with these issues daily, right? So when we talk about the collection of organic waste material, there's so much room for innovation to have that with local organizations that are already doing, the waste. And I'm a huge advocate of gardening. So for me, in our backyard, when we had our collection of compost, we didn't put certain things in that compost because we knew it was gonna be bad. So one of the things that we were not going to put in there was citrus, because that would make the compost more acidic and it would be, damaging to certain plants. So for me, when we're gonna collect all these organic waste materials, is it gonna be used for compost and returned back to the community? Are people who are in low-income communities, are they gonna be, fined the same as a person who's living in a mansion in Beverly Hills? So all of these local issues really have to have a voice within the legislation that is being created. And that leads to the second recommendation, which is having that national dialogue. So the panel recommends that interest groups be heard by official hearings by Congress in the state and the local levels to discuss the roles of federal preemptions in hopes of having a practicable, workable approach in sharing powers among themselves. Now, the panel calls for these hearings to be inclusive as possible, with testimony directly with those who are affected, including local officials, business owners, labor leaders, and interest groups. And now the idea is a good way in the right direction. However, it seems like it's a way for lobbyists to push their agenda even further and giving lobbyists this official platform, when it's constituents, the voters who have the power to push different types of legislation. I feel like that's where we should be heading, before there, because Congress members really should be listening to them already. There's no point in giving, this lobbyist a platform when it's that's what Congress people are there for. They're supposed to listen to us. So the panel suggesting that the hearings be inclusive fails to recall the history that Congress and executive leadership is not inclusive at all, and that there is no direction for national dialogue that would benefit marginalized communities. Businesses could already be lining up their pockets of legislators for congressmen members to listen better to them. So this recommendation, I feel like it fails to recognize the corrupt lobbying that is already present. And instead of national dialogue, I feel like there should be more investment in listening to constituents and communities who are doing the work on the ground. And so the third recommendation is that the panel recommends that Congress and federal agencies increase their commitment to prepare their capacity to use actionable intergovernmental assessments. So these assessments would decrease undesirable intergovernmental consequences and costs, and the assessments would be prepared by Congress, and federal agencies would be enacted whenever a federal preemption is proposed and before it is implemented by law. So the assessment is going to kind of help to guide the preemption before it's made and sealed. I feel like this is a good way, but I would only think of imagine waiting months during the pandemic to know whether we were going to be masked or not because the mandate was under review. So although it would also be taking up time, right? I can also picture it being, taken up to the courts because, hey, this is unconstitutional. And we see that right now, even with executive orders being pushed, right? They're always in the courts saying, is it constitutional? Is it not constitutional? We saw it with DACA, we saw it with the student debt relief. So there's always this type of assessment of, is it legal, is it not legal? And that can also help to, like if we were to have this collaboration within Congress to create student debt relief or to pass immigration reform, there wouldn't have that clash. And so there would be no need for, the laws to say, or the courts to hold it up, because it's a joint effort and hopefully people would be getting along. And with that, the panel recommends that both an Intergovernmental Partnership Act and Federalism Action Plan, which is the IPA and the FAP, would be passed, which would extend the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act of 1995. And then the last recommendation is that the development of federalism research agenda. So as information is low, it is imperative that data is increased to be used by policymakers. So the current lack of long-term data sources and intergovernmental analysis provides an inadequate basis for preparing credible federalism assessments of the type that the panel believes necessary to support an appropriate rebalancing of the federal system. So data is very important for policy development and implementation. Like you said, Faisal, right? How are we going to know how to, with the people that are collecting the organic waste material, if we don't have the numbers, if it's working or it's not working, or how much is it actually costing to haul, organic waste to a different level? And is it actually good for the environment, or is it more damaging because now we have trucks bustling in and out? So all of that data is very important in creating legislation that would be beneficial. I feel like this article, and we'll actually move out, sorry. Before I move into what I think about this article, what do you think of these recommendations on a scale of 1 through 5? Do you find that these recommendations are relevant as of today, with 1 being not at all relevant and 5 being very relevant? And you can just write the number on the chat between 1 through 5. How relevant do you feel these recommendations are? Right. Well, I feel like these recommendations are, I would say they're somewhat relevant. I think that the article is a bit outdated and is disconnected from the political turmoil of today. Depending on who is in power, right? These preemptions, if they're coming from executive orders, can be welcome with a view of great leadership, or they're seen as an overreach of power by a dictator. Even when Congress sends out legislation, there's always the talk about, oh, how, is it, did both parties work on it, right? Did they reach across the aisle? And by how much? There's always that count of vote of how much did the other group participate or support? And they're really counting the votes. So I feel like this polarization that we're living in right now in the government is so extreme that there is little effective analysis of preemptions that could separate it from their executor. So one prime example is the Affordable Care Act, right? Which became known as Obamacare, and certain people were against it because of the nickname that it had. So in a survey, if you were to give people saying, hey, do you believe it that we should have the Affordable Care Act? And they're like, yeah, we'll support it. And then you tell the same group, what about Obamacare? And they're like, no, we don't want it. So that sentiment of polarized dynamics between the political groups has really, I feel, affected the way that preemptions can be beneficial to the entire nation, right? So especially in the life-saving situations that we had within COVID, right? It was the executive power of of helping the government to stay on track that really was beneficial. But I feel like there should also be reasonable input that improves the policy, just enough to make a difference within the local communities, but not too much that it would hinder policy from actually moving forward. And so entrusting that political officials are doing what's best for the people, and that everybody is doing what they're supposed to. So long as the federal government exists, preemptions will continue to exist. And that is my presentation.
Thank you, Janine. Very well done. I experienced some of the preemption when I was on the school board during COVID, and we, as a special purpose district, we were preempted by the county as well as the state in terms of making decisions about masking and being open. And that was something that oftentimes parents and constituents didn't understand. And they would come to the school board and say, well, why are you doing this? And well, we're preempted. We cannot make a decision about masks. Those decisions are being made at the county level and at the state level. And I agree with you, Janine. I think you make a really good point about some of these recommendations being a bit outdated, and especially in our current political climate. Things such as, creating this national dialogue about federalism and about preemption. I think that's going to be difficult because people oftentimes think about things in the issue perspective. So when you think about the issue, they don't really think about the issue from the perspective of the relationship between governments. Federalism just is not at the top of their agenda. I think that's also true for members of Congress. And passing these acts, what's the political payoff for them in spending their time on this? They have much more political payoff in terms of taking very high-profile stances on high-profile issues, claiming credit for projects in order to get reelected, doing casework for their constituents. Those are the types of things that have political payoff. Talking about, doing studies of federalism and intergovernmental relations, there's just not really that bang for your buck politically. And so I agree with you. I think a lot of those recommendations are a bit idealistic, especially in today's day and age. So very well done. Thank you, Janine. And we will wrap up the show tonight with Crystal and James Madison's Federalist number 39. So Crystal, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
I'm on an older laptop that I bummed from work. So I don't even have a camera, but let me share my screen. Okay, everyone can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So we're shifting gears a little bit. Thank you so much, Professor, and everyone in class for bearing with me while I had a couple fiasco weeks. But I'm going to be doing my presentation tonight on Federalist number 39. This was a particularly difficult what is the word I'm looking for? I guess a difficult read, considering the context and the timing and the word usage. So I'm going to try to play it down or put it in layman's terms as much as possible. So let's see. There are essentially two anti-federalist. Oh, shoot, sorry. Ha! Sorry.
Crystal, are you still there?
Hi, Crystal, do you hear us?
Yeah, I don't think she's hearing us. I mean, I saw the slide move, and so we had progress, but oh. Okay, our screen just went black. I'm guessing there are laptop issues, probably, if it's a borrowed laptop. Crystal, can you hear us? Yeah, I think we may have lost Crystal. Let me see if she's still in the session and still sharing.
Dropped out.
I think we just lost Crystal. I think she just dropped out. So we'll give it a minute or two, see if she can log back in. Federalist 39 is actually, Crystal's right, is that it's sometimes it's a difficult read. All the Federalist papers are like that just because of the different use of language at the time as compared to the language we use today. And I think I told you last time there was a great article, the Diamond article, that talks about the differences in language and how it's difficult for us to superimpose our meanings of words onto the meanings used by the framers. And I think that, that's always difficult when we read writings from the late 1700s. But I do really like Federalist number 39 because it was a way in which Madison was I like to think about it, he was thinking like a social scientist, in that he took the Constitution and he really deconstructed it into its component elements in order to try and convince, or at least reassure, the citizens of New York and the anti-federalists that, this is nothing to fear, that this new Constitution is something you're familiar with. It's something that will not create too strong of a national government. And, he really broke the Constitution down into its component elements and asked the basic question, is it national or is it federal? Is it central government or is it controlled by central national government, or is it more controlled by the states? And I think that I really like the way he critically analyzed the Constitution. But I don't see Crystal coming back in. She's not back yet, so I'm assuming she probably had a major laptop issue. I don't want to steal too much of the thunder from Federalist 39 because she will, need to lead the discussion on it when she's able to. So I think she may be gone. So I don't want to make everyone hang around and wait and to see what happens. I know, like I said, I had a couple of issues with my connection tonight as well. So I guess what we're probably best doing, since it's been a few minutes and she's not back, maybe just pushing her for another week, push her into next week, and maybe start off next week with Federalist 39 and allow her to do her discussion, and hopefully things will be working by then. But just to kind of, yeah, go ahead, Faisal.
I'm along the lines of Federalist number 39. Mm-hmm. The way he puts it, do you think at this point of time that we have lost the essence of Federalist 39? Because what I read is that the state government is more powerful than the federal government. But then at this point, I think that we have just switched the power balance has changed. And recently there was some argument going on the floor, and I think her name is Mazie Hirono from Hawaii, state senator. Somebody asked a question about Federalist paper. I can't remember, but exactly, I think it's 39. And then she said, we didn't know exactly what the Federalists were thinking about, but I think the Federalists clearly was very clear about how they were thinking about it. But then we have lost a sense of what really was. I mean, this might be something that we won't be able to discuss at a class, but probably, I don't know, I'm just sharing my thought.
Yeah, I agree with you. The framers really did believe that in primacy of state governments. They made arguments throughout the Federalist Papers about how we don't really have to worry about the national government becoming too strong because people will always have allegiance to state governments. They will always feel closer to state governments. And when you think about the time in which they were writing, that was true. If you had someone from America who went over to Europe and someone in Europe asked, where are you from? They wouldn't say, I'm from America. They would say, I'm a Virginian or I'm a New Yorker. And they really did have allegiance with their state government. Today, if someone goes overseas, I think they probably would say, I'm an American or I'm from the United States. And so I agree with you. I don't think that state governments have the same level of primacy today that they had when the framers were writing. And so, yes, I think you're absolutely right. And as we go through the class, we'll talk about some of the reasons why the states have lost that primacy. It's difficult for states to come together because of all the turf wars, and they're always competing against each other. It's difficult to fight back against very politically popular programs. And most federal programs tend to be politically popular, and it's difficult for state governors and for local officials to fight back against those politically popular programs. And there's just a lot of reasons why it's difficult for states to work together to contend against federal powers. So I would agree with you. I think that is correct. I think Crystal is back with us. So Crystal, you can go ahead if it's working or.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm actually, I had to join on my phone. So that I I don't really know. Should I just do an article later on in the semester that hasn't been claimed yet and do a retry? I just
sure.
Maybe yeah. I think this is this article cursed me or something.
Yeah, but I can. Yeah, we can certainly do that. Yeah, if you'd like to, send me an email, and we'll get a future article assigned to you and give you another week or two to prepare that. And I can go ahead and do 39. So I think that's fine.
Okay, so, I did have some discussion points that I wanted to use, but I don't think at this point it would even make any sense.
Okay. Well, yeah, just send me an email and we'll get you assigned to. We've got a couple of articles that are unaccounted for, so we'll get you assigned to one of those articles instead. But as we were talking about, as Faisal had mentioned, one of the interesting things is that the way in which we view state governments today is certainly a lot different than the way in which they're viewed when Madison was writing. Faisal, go ahead.
Just thinking that, let's say, California breaks into two states, Northern California and Southern California. According to the 39, we had to have 75% of the states to agree on it. Is it still applicable? Does the 75% or the 2/3 majority apply at this day of time? Or is it a different process?
It would be Congress. Congress would have to decide. So Congress would have to pass legislation enabling these new states and authorizing these new states to join the union. So it's something that will be done in Congress. And so even though you have the state of California may through the ballot box say, yes, we want to become 3 different states, that doesn't have any legal standing until Congress authorizes it. And that's a similar thing as in Article 10, when we talked about interstate compacts. It's a similar type of thing. The Constitution says that Congress must authorize any interstate compacts. And so a lot of these quote unquote compacts that we have between states are not truly compacts in that they have not truly been authorized by Congress. So it would depend upon what Congress would decide about admitting new states into the union. States cannot do it themselves. Congress is the one that has to make that decision. So yeah, a lot of things have certainly changed. I think that what Madison does in 39 is he's trying to allay the fears of anti-federalists and the citizens of New York in 2 ways. One, he says, this new national government and this new constitution, it's nothing that's unusual. It's something that you should be familiar with. You have the 4-year terms for presidents, you shouldn't be scared about that because some states have 4- and 6-year terms for their governors. So that's nothing unusual. So you shouldn't be scared with this because it's really kind of mirrors what's going on in a lot of the states. And then he said, you also shouldn't be afraid of it because it's really, the Constitution is a combination of federal, of national and federal approaches. So he said, let's break the Constitution up into its component elements. And so first let's ask, how is the Constitution, how is the new union formed? He says, well, the new union was formed by the states. And we had discussed this before, that the Constitutional Convention, those delegates were there as representatives of their states. So the states joined together to create this new union and this new constitution. This new constitution was ratified, will be ratified by at least 9 out of 13 states, state legislatures. So the union, the constitution is created by the states. That really did, so that makes it what he called federal. So when states have the power, it's federal. When the national government has the power, it's national. So in terms of the creation of the union, it's federal in that the states had control of the creation of the union. That served the purposes of Madison and Federalist 39 for making this argument. The problem, though, as we had pointed out a couple of weeks ago, is it laid the foundations for the Civil War because it laid the foundations for the states' rights approach. So that southern states could say, well, we joined together, we put together this union as states, and so therefore we can leave the union. And so the whole argument for secession from the union came from these seeds laid by Madison in writings such as Federalist 39. But he says it's federal in terms of how it was put together. Well, then he says, how about in terms of where power comes from the Constitution? Who has the power? Well, we have a bicameral legislature, which means we have a House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives is proportional representation elected directly by the people. But then we also have a U.S. Senate, and the U.S. Senate is equal representation, and the members of the Senate are not popularly elected. Members of the Senate are selected by state legislatures. So with the House of Representatives, that's more of a national type of approach because of popular election. In the Senate, it's more of a federal approach in that the states have much more say about who will be in that Senate. So it's kind of a combination of the two. So in terms of the extent of powers, it's combined between a national and a federal approach. But it says, well, how about something like the operations of government? And so the daily operations of the government. Well, here in terms of daily operations of the government, Madison says, okay, I will concede it's national because the government will be operated by individuals. There will be individual people who are in these positions. And as such, the operation of the government is going to be national in nature. But how do we change the Constitution? How do we amend the Constitution? Well, here, how we amend the Constitution, we've got another federal national type of component here, in that amendments to the Constitution are going to be proposed by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, but they have to be ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. So there's a very prominent role to play for state governments in the ratification of amendments to the Constitution. And essentially what Madison argues is it's a compromise. The Constitution is this compromise of a national and federal approach, but clearly you really get the feeling from 39 that yes, it's a combination of the two, but if you had to choose one, it really trends more toward the federal approach. It really trends more toward the protection of states' rights. Now, we shouldn't be surprised that he comes to that conclusion because that's the whole purpose of the Federalist Papers, is to convince people that states will retain their sovereignty and you don't need to fear this new national government. Now, the upshot of all of this is what Faisal was talking about, which is, are these arguments true today? And so is it really still this combination of a national and a federal approach? And in some regards, it's probably now more national, certainly, than it is federal. If you think about the extent of powers and who has the power, sure, under Federalist 39 at that time, you could argue that the House of Representatives is more national and the Senate is more federal. Well, with the 17th Amendment, we now have the direct election of senators. And so that makes the Senate more national in nature and erodes some of that state government power in terms of the argument of extent of powers, because now the Senate is a bit more reflective of the more national nature of the House of Representatives. And so I think that you've really seen this erosion in terms of the federal approach, and now the way in which we interpret the Constitution today is much more in terms of that national type of approach, more power for the central, the national government. You also have to think about James Madison too, and he kind of had a change of heart. And so when Madison was writing this, Madison was very much an advocate of a strong national government. And so you'll hear he was trying to convince people, don't be afraid of the national government, but he was an advocate of a strong national government. He was a Federalist. Then later in his career, as you know, he became the Secretary of State to Thomas Jefferson. And when he became Jefferson's Secretary of State, he became a Jeffersonian Republican or a Democratic Republican, which meant that he kind of went to the other side of the argument and he started talking more about states' rights and talking more about protection of state sovereignty. So throughout his career, he kind of morphed from being a ardent Federalist to being much more of an anti-Federalist and Jeffersonian Republican. And so even Madison kind of had a little shift in terms of his philosophy, in terms of national versus state power. So I think this Federalist 39, when he wrote it from the perspective of being a Federalist. I think if he would have written this perhaps in the Jefferson administration or even in his own Madisonian administration, I think it probably would have looked a lot different, because at that time he was much more of an anti-Federalist than he was when Federalist 39 was originally written. That's important for us because, again, it underscores the dynamic nature of American federalism. Not only has federalism changed over time in terms of the balance of power with the different eras of federalism, but individuals can change their perspective on federalism over time as well. Sandra Day O'Connor is a good example on the Supreme Court of someone who changed her perspective in terms of federalism and became much more of an advocate of states' rights during her time on the court than she was when she first joined the court. And so I think it's, just underscores this whole idea that federalism is very much of a dynamic type of interpretation. But we have had this ebb and flow throughout our history of federalism between a focus on national power versus decentralization down to the state government level. And we've kind of bounced back and forth. And one of the reasons why we've had this ebb and flow of national versus state power has obviously been the interpretation of the Constitution and the interpretation of American federalism by the US Supreme Court. And we had mentioned last week about these cases, the NLC versus usury case in 1976 and the Garcia versus Samta case in 1985. Where the Supreme Court, in the course of 9 years, went from a state sovereignty, protecting state government power approach in NLC versus usury to turning it all over to the political realm and saying, well, it's up to Congress and it's up to the national government to decide what power state governments have in terms of their ability to issue debt. And so just in a 9-year period of time, you've seen the Supreme Court swing from a state rights approach to much more of a national approach. Then in the 1990s, we saw the Supreme Court swing back to a states' rights type of an approach. We had a series of cases such as in 1992, we had the New York versus US case, where Sandra Day O'Connor, writing for the majority, argued that states had some protection in terms of federal mandates of taking title of low-level radioactive waste, and said state governments as sovereigns didn't have to follow this national law. We had the Brady Bill case, the Prince case. And the Prince case, you had the Supreme Court again giving protections to state governments, saying the national government cannot require state and local governments to conduct and pay for these background checks for firearm purchases. It's come to be known as the Prince entitlement. And there's a whole series of those cases in the 1990s where the Supreme Court really tended to side with state governments. Then a decade later, we start to see the Supreme Court shifting more toward a centralizing approach again. where they started striking down some states' rights and started giving broad berth to Congress in terms of its ability to regulate interstate commerce and to utilize the elastic clause to issue mandates and orders to state and local governments. So again, we kind of, it's what we call ping pong federalism. We ping pong back and forth in terms of centralization versus decentralization. And politically, we do it all the time. When we have one administration replace a previous administration, we've seen it with when the Trump administration replaced the Obama administration. We're seeing it again when the Biden administration replacing the Trump administration. Obama administration, we had a little bit more of a centralization type of approach from the national government level. Trump administration, a little bit more of a decentralization approach. Biden administration kind of shifting back to a centralization approach. Every 4 years, we tend to ping pong back and forth in terms of our perspectives on federalism. As students of federalism, that's important to us because it means it's difficult for us to study federalism. When federalism is always changing, you've got a moving target, and the more that target moves, the more difficult it is for us as students of federalism to study that target. So again, I like Federalist 39 just because of the way Madison organized his argument and the way in which he deconstructed the Constitution. But we also have to remember that Federalist 39 really is a creature of its time, in that if it was written 10 years later or 20 years later, Madison probably would have written that paper a lot differently than he did when he wrote Federalist 39. Any other observations on Federalist 39 or this idea of national versus federal in terms of our interpretation of the Constitution? Okay, if not, oh yeah, go ahead.
The caucuses, where did the caucus system come in? At what point?
You mean in terms of parties? Party caucuses?
I mean like the caucus and also the electoral college.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Electoral College is embodied in the Constitution, but the Electoral College obviously was changed as a result of the 12th Amendment. And so whenever we had the 12th Amendment that changed the way in which we elect presidents and vice presidents, that's when we got on the modern version of the Electoral College. Now, the Electoral College doesn't work the way in which the framers intended it to work. You know, the electors today are dominated by the political parties. And so if you win the popular vote in the state, then your slate of electors will then go to the state capitol and vote for you, and those will be the electoral votes from that state. Those electors are beholden to the campaign in the political party. That's not how it was supposed to be. Under the original Electoral College, those were supposed to be independent electors who were experts, you know, people who were who knew about politics and knew about government, because the framers really feared popular sentiment. They really feared public opinion, and they wanted the Electoral College to serve as a check on that popular opinion. So the Electoral College doesn't really work the way in which it was supposed to. In terms of party caucuses, you know, the growth of political parties happened very quickly. You know, George Washington warned us about political parties, and he told us we should not form political parties because these political parties would end up being those types of factions that Madison warned us about in Federalist number 10. But despite those warnings from George Washington, immediately we started developing a party system, and we've really always gravitated toward that two-party system. So the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were the antecedents for that two-party system. And then we saw you know, the Whig Party develop. We saw Democratic Republicans develop. The Democratic Republicans then turned into the Democratic Party in 1828. We saw the Whig Party then eventually turn into, or the remnants of the Whig Party turned into the Republican Party, formed in 1856 and won the White House in 1860. And then once we have these two modern day parties, they then work very hard to survive. And the way in which they survive is to devise electoral systems that will benefit those two primary parties. And so we have a system with the Electoral College where it's very difficult for third parties to win Electoral College votes. It's a winner-take-all system in 48 out of 50 states, with the exception of Nebraska and Maine. Other than that, it's a winner-take-all type of system. And that makes it difficult. If you're a third party, it's next to impossible for you to win electoral college votes. That's why we saw, like in 1992, Ross Perot, when he ran as a independent candidate or Reform Party candidate, I guess he was, he got 19% of the vote, which is a really impressive showing, but he got 0 electoral college votes. The last candidate who got any electoral college votes was George Wallace back in 1968. And he only got electoral college votes because of his racist platform and in southern states, and that's where he got his electoral college votes from. But you can win a good portion of popular votes and still fail to get electoral college votes because of the winner-take-all system that we have in the way in which we implement our electoral college. And so the two parties have really insulated themselves from challenges from third parties. I think that's where you then have these strong party caucuses in both the House and the Senate, and that imposition of party discipline by those party leaders. On the Republican side, they refer to themselves as a conference. On the Democratic side, they refer to themselves as being a caucus. But we've always gravitated toward that two-party system. Where we have had successful third parties, those successful third parties tend to be what we refer to as splinter parties, in that they splinter off from one of the major parties because of their disagreement over a particular issue. Well, the problem for splinter parties is that once they start to pick up steam and once they start to get people supporting them, what does the major party do? The major party then adopts that platform on that issue, and then there goes their support. And then they get reabsorbed into that major party. So it's been very difficult for splinter parties to actually have any longevity because they end up getting reabsorbed when their issue platforms get reabsorbed into the primary party platform. And so I don't see a whole lot of prospect for us getting away from the two-party system in the very near future, just because things are really designed to help prop up and support those two parties. It will be interesting, though, at the national level in 2024 on the Republican side to see who gets a nomination and probably more importantly, who does not get the nomination. And so I could foresee a situation where former President Trump does not get the nomination, that he might splinter off and form his own political party, and then that could splinter the Republican Party and then make it very difficult for the Republican Party to win in 2024, or at least for the foreseeable future. But we'll see what happens. But I think that is a potential that is out there. So I'm sorry, I don't mean to digress on political parties and politics, but it is important journalism.
Do you think Ron DeSantis has the chance?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that he's got a lot of support as the alternative, and I'm sure he hates that being thought of as the alternative. But yeah, I think he's got a lot of support. And if you have a situation again where he ends up getting the nomination, then I think you could very well see former President Trump take a lot of his supporters and move off into another party, and then you've got chaos. So we'll see what happens, but that is possible. That's happened in the past. We had the Dixiecrats that left the Democratic Party and formed their own splinter party, and that's where George Wallace came from in 1968, and that's how George Wallace ended up getting some electoral votes. Now, not a whole lot. I think he won Alabama, Mississippi, and maybe 3 states in the South, but was successful at getting some electoral college votes, which is highly unusual in our two-party system.
Did you foresee any Bernie-crats breaking off the Democratic Party?
I think it's possible. I think that there's obviously dissatisfaction among the more progressive wing of the party, and there is a battle going on in the Democratic Party between progressives and more moderate Democrats. It could possibly happen. I think that they do realize that if that happens and you split the Democratic vote, then obviously they're not going to win for a long time in the future. And I don't know if Bernie Sanders would be willing to do that. Bernie Sanders isn't a Democrat. Bernie Sanders is a Democratic socialist. He's an independent. He caucuses with the Democrats, but he's not a Democrat. Angus King in the state of Maine is also not a Democrat. He caucuses with Democrats, but he is an independent. So sometimes when we say we've got, probably going to have a 51-49 Senate, 51 Democrats, 49 Republicans, it's really 49-49 and 2. And those two just naturally caucus with the Democratic Party. I don't ever see those two really ever moving over and caucusing with the Republicans, but it's important to remember that they are still not Democrats. And so it's an interesting situation. You have someone who is not a Democrat running for the nomination of the Democratic Party. But I don't know. I don't really see as much of a prospect of that happening on the Democratic side as I see it perhaps happening on the Republican side, especially if Ron DeSantis is the one who gets the nomination. Could be a very interesting 2024. We still have some elections that haven't been decided too, that we're still waiting on recounts, and there's up where I live in a school district race, there's actually a 5-vote difference between two candidates in one of the areas, and it really, some of those elections were actually that close in this election. So very interesting stuff.
Thank you, Professor.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great point, and I'm glad you brought it up, Faisal. And I think it's federalism has become so political. I think it is important that we remember those political elements. It's much more political today than it is constitutional, and it's also very fiscal. In that federalism is really dictated by money today, more so than it was prior to the 1930s. And that's our segue then into next week's topic, which is one of my favorites, and that's fiscal federalism. And we'll talk about how the relationship between different levels of government really ends up being dictated by money, especially the use of grants and aid. So for next week, we will pick up with the economics of intergovernmental grants, which is Luis's article. Moiki has the federal grants and aid article. Jocelyn has the Spraj article, Entrepreneurial Cities, one of my favorites. And Jake has the Financing Local Government article. And then the Why Categorical Grants article has not been picked by anyone. And so if no one picks that by next week, then I will go ahead and lead the discussion on that. So we have 5 articles on fiscal federalism for next week. So if you want to do your article critique on any of those articles, please be sure to have your critiques turned in before class next Monday. And we'll cover fiscal federalism next week. And then the week after that, we'll then move into the administrative aspects of federalism. I look forward to reading your Beach Board post coming up for this week, where you look at a public interest group and talk about the success of that interest group in lobbying Congress. And then, as always, providing responses to at least 2 of your classmates. Well, thank you very much for tonight. I hope the articles were interesting, and we're kind of picking up some steam now in terms of our coverage of federalism. Hope you have a great week, and then I'll see you back here at 6 o'clock next Monday. So take care, everyone. See you next Monday.
Thank you. Good night.
Have a nice Thanksgiving.
Good night.